true.
Stylish even when it's below 0 degrees.
Cool weather has no.
You don't want to see what's under there.
Sorry, we're a bit late. Traffic was a little daunting. But good morning, and thank you for being here. Obviously, this is an important issue. And interestingly, overnight, I heard a lot of rhetoric about the proposal that we're going to be discussing here today. In my mind, a lot of that rhetoric demonstrates an example of what the Democrats will do in order to protect the status quo. For instance, I've heard that we're going to propose forced bankruptcy. That is absolutely untrue. While we are drafting some language on bankruptcy, we are not introducing that today. I've heard that this situation is like Flint, Michigan. That is not true either. As you know, in that instance, the governor did not act. In this instance, we are demanding action and asking for something to happen with regards to the Chicago Public Schools. We are willing to help Chicago Public Schools, but we have been met and stonewalled by Mike Madigan and the Democratic majority who continue to try to protect the status quo. So I'm really glad that you're here today to find out what we are proposing. And what we're proposing is a lifeline. We're filing legislation that paves the way for a state-created independent authority to assume control over the Chicago public school system. We didn't come to this lightly, but the track record of the Chicago and its public school system is abysmal. Despite $600 million of additional financial advantage that the city schools receive, Chicago continues to dig a financial hole deeper and deeper, and it's in constant crisis. That crisis always ends up with a plea for additional money for Chicago at the expense of school districts in the suburban and downstate communities. It has to end. The taxpayers and the children of the city schools deserve better, and we are proposing this lifeline. Important to note, this legislation will be filed in both the House and the Senate. It is consistent with current state law that governs all 860 school districts in the state of Illinois. That legislation was supported and, in fact, championed by the Democrat majority. It recognizes Chicago Public Schools' difficulties. It includes Chicago Public Schools in the State Board of Education's district intervention law. They were excluded when that law was passed. It allows the State Board of Education to remove the current Chicago Public School Board of Education and create an independent authority for CPS until the State Board of Education determines that CPS is no longer in financial difficulty. Additionally, it makes it clear in the legislation that the state is not responsible or liable for the school district's liabilities and their debt. I'm going to turn it over to Jim for a little additional
Thank you,
info.
Chris, and good morning. And as Chris said, there's a lot of chatter going on about what exactly we're trying to do, but as she's stated, that we are throwing Chicago and CPS a lifeline. The Chicago Public Schools are facing massive layoffs and a possible teacher strike. And despite credit downgrades to junk status, CPS is now looking to long-term bonds to pay for hundreds of millions of dollars in short-term operating expenses. CPS and the city of Chicago are in a state of crisis, a crisis that they have had for years to prepare for and that could have been averted. Because Chicago and CPS are experiencing financial hardship related to their fiscal health and pension obligations, we plan to file legislation in the near future which will afford the city of Chicago and CPS the authority to seek bankruptcy protection, just as 24 other states currently permit for their local governments. To echo Leader Radogno, we believe that taxpayers and the school children of Illinois and Chicago deserve better. The goal here is to provide the tools to right the ship. I want to re-emphasize this. This is not a bailout. This is not a state bailout of CPS. Taxpayers statewide should not and will not be held responsible for the historically bad decisions made by Chicago politicians. Again, this is not a bailout. I would like to now hand it over to Representative Ron Sandak. Representative Sandak, for the past few years, has been championing the issue of municipal bankruptcy. And I would like for him to be able to speak briefly about it, and then we can open it up for questions.
Good morning. I'm Ron Sandak. I'm the state representative from the 81st District. Last year, I proposed a bankruptcy bill for all municipalities and all units of local government. At that time, there was no unit of government that I had in mind, but rather I thought it was an appropriate tool to be used judiciously by units of government, mayors, school board presidents, should economic disaster befall them, and provide, frankly, a mechanism to restructure finances for the betterment of taxpayers. To echo Leader Durkin, there's nothing new about Chapter 9. It's been in law for many years. It just requires an enacting statute, meaning a state has to permit its municipalities to afford themselves of the opportunity to restructure their debts. Chapter 9's been around for a long time. 26 states already do it. I would offer California as a good example, and of course Michigan, most notably with Detroit. It is a means to restructure debt. It's not a get out of jail free. It's not a corporate sale of assets, but rather an organized, time-tested mechanism that could help and be a beneficial tool. Thank you much.
We're happy to take questions at this point. Not necessarily. School funding tends to be very much a regional issue. This will take 30 votes, not a supermajority. Issues. I think there's definitely a crisis in confidence in the leadership in Chicago, even amongst Chicago legislators. And this certainly would impact the pool of money that's available for both suburban and downstate districts, both of which are represented by both Democrats and Republicans.
Well, if the Democrat leaders want to continue with the status quo with the city of Chicago and CPS, then sure, it is dead on arrival. That is to their peril. If they want to continue that way, I think it's unfortunate. It's part of the bigger picture of what's going on in the state of Illinois. They're not moving, they're not budging, they're not willing to cooperate with the governor, the elected governor, and also the Republicans who are seeking a way to get through impasse, but also to bring some type of stability to the Chicago public schools.
Would the authority be able to break the teachers' union contract and just kind of not have to abide by some of the provisions in that contract, although they are without a contract?
Right, there is no contract, but they would take over the function of the board in negotiating that contract. In fact, specifically in this legislation, the oversight authority would not be able to impact any collective bargaining contracts that are in place.
But they
currently.
would be able to negotiate a new contract with the union.
Well, what about Chapter 9? If in fact you got to that point, Chapter 9 would affect that contract, wouldn't it, Ron?
Chapter 9 could. Executory contracts, any ongoing contract in existence at the time of filing could be subject to renegotiation. It doesn't mean it gets kicked to the curb, but it means it's subject to being reopened and rediscussed.
But you're counting on downstate Dems, suburban Dems, I guess. I mean, you proposed this, but where's your support?
It's day one. We're going to file our bills shortly in both chambers, and it's like any other bill. It's going to take a natural progression. But the fact is, I think that there's a growing dissatisfaction in Springfield towards how the Democrat leaders have been handling the state of Illinois, period, but also putting this rest of the situation of the Chicago public schools, who get an enhanced contribution from the state of Illinois through the block grant on a yearly basis. I think that they're starting to figure out that, you know what, CPS needs to be held accountable to the same standards as the rest of the schools in the state of Illinois. And for them to say that they're exempt under the authority, I think is myopic, is nearsighted, but its time has come that they need to be held accountable, just as my school district, your school district, and every school district from the southern Illinois to the northwest part of the state.
Leader Durkin, what's your message to representatives from the city of Chicago who have constituents who attend these public schools? What is your message to them?
Do they want to make their schools better? Do they want to make their schools better? That's what this is about. This is about making the Chicago public schools more accountable to the taxpayers of Chicago and also to the taxpayers of Illinois. That's going to bring a better school system.
Leader, in Michigan, Governor imposed a new person who took over control away from locals much like this. Guy decided that he wanted to save some money on the water system, and we now know what happened. What guarantees is there that if you have a new state board that you take over the agency from public schools, same kind of blow-ups and everything?
I mean, All right, it's Flint, Michigan. I'm not going to say that anything that happens in Flint is going to be a repeat in Illinois if this bill is passed. But the fact is, I have confidence that if we get to that point where there will be an appointed school board, it is going to be one that is going to be accountable, a group that is going to look at the Chicago Public Schools in a holistic manner. Finances, what's going on in the classroom? What are we doing about our graduation rate? How are we going to make that better? What are we doing to prepare our kids for the next stage in life? That's what they have to do. That's what I'm going to insist upon.
There's no
There's no
guarantee
guarantees
in
in
life
life,
in
Greg.
anything. But the fact of the matter is this process has been used, in fact, in Proviso Township High Schools. They are coming out of the oversight, and that's been a success story. So it doesn't guarantee anything, but what it does do is it opens up the Chicago Public Schools for a much more transparent view of what's going on. Right now, the same people that control the state, control the city, appoint the school board, appoint the bureaucrats that run it, and that has certainly not been working out so well for the school. So at least this is an opportunity to have some positives.
Give us a timetable, because this does seem like a long-term idea when there's a short-term crisis right now that they're facing. I mean, realistically, how quickly could this happen?
It's up to two guys, Mike Madigan and John Cullerton. They decide when a bill is going to be called. They have plenary authority in Springfield on any piece of legislation. So the question's up to them. You know, they can talk all they want and try to avoid the inherent problems that are going on in the state of Illinois, which they've created over the past 12 years. So I'm not going to let that cloud on the problems that the Democrats of Illinois, what they've done to the state finances, to our unemployment, just things we've been talking about forever. But the fact is, they can say what they want, and they can go and continue to say this is unfair, this is not right. But the bigger issue is, what have they done to make the state of Illinois and city of Chicago Public Schools better over the past 12 years while they've controlled Springfield with supermajorities?
Well, and the pension, let me add to that, the pension equity issue, which again, we've talked about being willing to tackle, will not address the problems, all the problems they have. They've had that inventory control issue. They had the Barbara Bennett Boyd issue. They've had botched school closings. They have a lot of problems that go beyond their normal cost pension payment, which is $200 million.
But you guys are all politicians. I mean, you got to understand the embarrassment that this would cause people like Mayor Emanuel or the Democratic leaders. I mean, certainly you have to be sensitive.
Do you think the status quo? The status quo is not working. And the fact is, what we're doing is that we are throwing them, as we stated earlier, a lifeline. And you know, nothing's easy. But the fact is, our goal is to help them, about helping the schools, helping those kids who go there on a daily basis, producing a better result.
How does this bill, though, solve the immediate financial problem that the school district is facing?
Well, it certainly would give an independent authority an opportunity to come in and look and see if there are resources that would be available. But what the Chicago Public School System is proposing doing is borrowing more money to get over this crisis. That is only digging the hole deeper. So what they're doing is absolutely not working. Maybe if there is no additional money available, that will force some discussions about how we can restructure things here in the state.
But the borrowing that Ian says, this is all about dismantling the public school system in favor of charter.
That's
That's not true.
absolutely
Not
not
true.
true.
Not true.
This applies to 860 other school systems in this state. Chicago's the only one that's excluded.
Well, that's a broader issue that we are continuing, and Senator
What's that,
Radogno and I have indicated to the Speaker and the President that we're going to work on a school aid formula issue. But the fact is, I see a big, fat $600 million block grant that comes to Chicago Public Schools on an annually basis. And I know the numbers that are coming in from the suburbs of Collier counties down into the State Board of Education that's being dispersed, and I know it's being cut up. But the fact is, I don't accept that argument, but this is all part of what we should be negotiating towards reaching a budget, solution to a budget, but also bringing some accountability to CPS, who, as I said earlier, receive an enhanced amount of revenue from the Illinois taxpayers.
The number, I
Black
don't
grant,
agree
black-
with those numbers. You can do a lot with numbers. The fact of the matter is that the state, if you compare what the state spends for K through 12, that benefits students, CPS receives $1.6 billion from the statewide appropriation. That's 24% of the statewide total. So, figures, well, I won't use it.
John, do anything?
You're talking about next week is what they need to take debt service payments that are coming due, I believe, some of them in February. So by raising bankruptcy now, why are you coming forward with this now?
Well, because we're not meeting in Springfield. They decide to cancel sessions. They decide to avoid any legislative meetings. So we have to take the action upon ourselves. They're going to sit on the sidelines and let things crumble. We're not going to let that happen. We're going to try to do what we think is right for the city of Chicago and CPS.
When you're talking about accountability, this seems like you're moving away from that with an appointed school board that the voters of Chicago don't have an actual stake in. Why not try an elected school board? If you're talking about accountability.
That is that is part of the proposal, that if we get to that point, the hypothetical, if you do have an independent board that is appointed, and when the state feels that the city of Chicago or CPS is in a better situation, then it'll be an elected, this legislation will form a process for an elected school board.
Does it offer a timetable for that, or does it have to be?
It's following a decision that's made by the superintendent and state board that the school is in a better place, financial place, and that they feel that they are ready to meet their obligations.
CPS is one of the largest employers in the state. What do attorney labs, possible bankruptcy, I mean, what concern do you have economically about this district being under state takeover or all these layoffs? I mean, economically, what ripple effects could you see with this being the largest employer in the state?
Well, obviously, we're trying to avoid that happening. What's happening now is proposed layoffs based on the status quo. We're trying to change that status quo. We don't feel like we've had a good look at what's going on in Chicago Public Schools. Everybody is sort of inbred in terms of the political system. So the proposed authority would be, they have requirements. People need to have expertise in education, in finance, and they have to, some of them have to be local people as well, so they also have a stake in it.
Governor Rauner asked me to.
We've actually had a conversation, and we came to it mutually, talking about alternatives that we might be able to come up with to help the school system.
And the legislation will be introduced by Senator Radogno and also under my name in the House. It's still in the drafting stage, but it'll be within the week. That is also, I think, within the week.
The state, the superintendent of schools, the state superintendent.
So the governor.
Beth Purvis is the state superintendent.
We'll find out. I will say this in just... I was at a coffee shop this morning, and people read the newspaper, and they were very pleased with it. And they said this is the right thing to do. I'm just saying anecdotally, look, it's going to be a lot of discussion over this. I don't think people, they hear the issue of bankruptcy. But bankruptcy is about restructuring. Just remember that. It's about restructuring. About restructuring debt. And the debt, Chicago's going out in the market. They took out $1.5 billion already in this past year, and they're going back out to secure another $875 billion that's going to be paid back. I don't know how they pay it back, but the fact is, something's got to change.
Why is it so important for you to take out that word bailout when you know that that's exactly what everybody's talking about?
Because it isn't.
There's no money that's going, there's no
It's in
money.
the legislation. The
This is
legislation
in
will
the
say that there's
governance
no
of
obligation of the state of
Chicago
Illinois
Public
from any.
But when you wipe away debt, it's still a bailout. I don't see why that's so important to you to say.
Chapter 9 is not a bailout. And again, you can avail yourselves of a number of illustrations. Detroit probably being an instructive example. Not a bailout to restructure debt. It's not a bailout to look at contracts, try and renegotiate them, and make them far more favorable to taxpayers. It's not a bailout to actually construct a fiscally and financially responsible plan to put the school system, which is critical, in a better place than it is. You know, folks have been asking questions. This young lady over here about it being a big employer. It is. but it's a dying employer right now. The system is absolutely collapsing on itself. To do nothing would be unconscionable.
I think that what we have is that the combination, whether it's going to be this affording, remember, it's a voluntary act, whether or not Chicago CPS are seeking bankruptcy protection. The other aspect of it would be the oversight, the independent oversight board, and I believe the third component of it is let's see.
The two concepts are the oversight board, bringing Chicago under the existing law, and the bankruptcy. So I think it's only two.
It's still in the drafting. I think it's only two.
Yeah. Best
The
purpose,
state
the
superintendent of education would.
Ron, you mentioned Troy. How long did that process
Oh,
take?
Tony Smith.
I don't know for exactly, Greg, but I think it was a year and a half to 2 years.
How do you run Chicago Public Schools? How does anybody get educated? How does anything get done for a year and a half of the organization?
Oh, it happens all the time. The city of San Bernardino was continually providing fire and police service. The city of Vallejo was a Chapter 9 reorganization. In Detroit, still provided educational and public safety services, all the while it was in that procedure. And it came out a healthier city. It is a better, more financially, fiscally sound city now than when it entered Chapter 9. I mean, you can just look at the balance sheet or talk to the people involved. It's in a better place now.
How many events specifically affect the classroom? How will it, while it's under bankruptcy, how will it affect the classroom? Does it mean bigger class sizes, less teachers? What actually, how specifically will it help affect the students?
Well, the short-term goal is to get the school finances in order, and the long-term goal, and short-term and long-term goal, is to ensure that the school days are going to continue, that the classrooms are going to be maintained, that teachers will be at school. I can't say what CPS is going to do in the short term and near term. They're talking about pink slips, but the fact is, at some point, you've got to be able to do something to change the current operations at CPS, and that's what we're trying to do.
The Democratic leaders now are rejecting this. It doesn't go anywhere. What does it mean for the $480 million bailout? They say they need.
That's a bailout.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. That's a bailout.
Can you go to the mic?
I'm sorry. Yeah,
So is that going to go anywhere if they don't take up the agreement?
I'm not voting for it.
Yeah, I think we've been pretty clear. There is no support to bail out Chicago or its schools if they're not willing to help themselves and if they're not willing to engage in a discussion to help the entire state. So that's on them.
So isn't this all about the governor's turnaround agenda at the end of the day?
It's about righting Chicago, CPS, and the state from long-term problems, yes.
Well, Kristen, as I said earlier, I mean, if Democrat leaders are not letting us meet in Springfield and they're canceling sessions, we have to do something. It's things that we feel strong about. And you know what? Chicago needs Springfield. Springfield needs Chicago. And it's a two-way street. And that's what we're trying to accomplish, whether it's negotiations on the broader issue, which is the budget impasse. But by sitting on the sidelines, I don't think it's the right thing to do for anyone with respect to the problems going on with Chicago public schools. That's the statement we're making today.
Would you guys send,
At
would
a
you guys
certain
send your
level, isn't this just setting up a blind date where you offer them something that they can't take, they offer big enough for you something you can't take, everybody twice and nothing is done?
Like, it's to their peril. If they want to just dismiss this, fine. Like, they've done every good idea that we have over the past year. I spent the summer down there. They're playing a lot of gotcha politics, but the fact is, we're talking about trying to do something, a concept, proposals that they should discuss with us, negotiate, try to find some common ground, as we've been trying to do with the budget. But the fact is, they continue on with status quo. They have not recognized the fact that a Republican won the office of governor last November, and that is the problem.
Would you guys send your bids to questions under
You have
bankruptcy?
no idea if their school is going to close next fall. They are facing it now. They have nowhere to go. What do you tell them now if this stalls?
Well,
They do.
if this stalls,
If this stalls,
well, then they need to call Mike Madigan and the Democrat majority. I mean,
that's a blame game again.
well, at some point, something has to be different, and we're proposing a different path. My assumption is if we got the new oversight authority, the first thing they would do is rather than go in and make changes, is look at the books, look at what they have to deal with. That might not result in any immediate changes for the children. But going forward, they would draw on the knowledge they acquired through that review to make recommendations that are different from what's happening now.
All right, thank you. Thank you.